America's military action in Venezuela, with Trump's Operation Absolute Resolve, are reshaping rapidly everything we know about geopolitics and international relations. And it is just the beginning. Mark my words that more is to come, be it from Cuba, Greenland, but also the implications for one specific country in this video, Iran. What the US did in Venezuela over the weekend is not routine intervention, covert ops, or just symbolic shows of force. Washington is removing a head of state and basically administrating an entire country. Nicolas Maduro is in New York on trumped-up charges, and Caracas and regimes alike it are all watching around the world, including the Islamic Republic in Iran. Venezuela is facing a systemic change, and that means Iran is certainly going to be in the eyes of not just Washington DC, but possibly Tel Aviv and Israel. This is not just a simple isolated military operation. It marks an inflection point for the international order, a paradigm shift in everything that we thought we knew. And in the case of Iran, it's not about framed as abstract deterrence. It's not dressed up in, say, diplomatic language, but it is being delivered plainly and in close temporal proximity. What I mean by that is that taken together, these events suggest something far more consequential, a deliberate effort to reassert American coercive power, reset expectations around sovereignty, and remind adversaries that distance, alliances, and time are frankly all incredibly irrelevant or selective. So in this video, I wanted to do three things. Firstly, lay out what the US has done in Venezuela and in terms of its implications. Place this, secondly, in the proper geopolitical context as an energy hub, a great power battleground, and the critical implications for regimes like Iran, but also China, Russia, and so on. And of course, most importantly, thirdly, look at this specifically for its implications of Iran, the Islamic Republic, and what is going on inside the country, which, if it hadn't been for Venezuela, we would be all focused on much more. But there is no qualms about it. Washington is not done. Trump is not finished, and he is intending to do something about the mullahs in Tehran. We have to understand what has happened in Venezuela, what it means for Iran, and what it means going forward for the international system as a whole, and whether the Iranian people will have their own Maduro moment or will see something a lot more unpredictable. Let's get into it.
This is The Global Gambit.
How you going, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, I usually do a little bit of an introduction, but I'm going to get straight to it because what is transpiring with Operation Absolute Resolve will mean this video is quickly out of date in some ways. There's just too much to know where to really begin, so I will be producing a series of videos tackling specific angles of not just Venezuela but also Iran. The British and French have conducted strikes in Syria, which demands its own little bit of analysis. Are the Europeans beginning to be more assertive, or is it just more statements? So let me know in the comments below what you think about developments right now, what you'd like to see, and what you think about the Venezuelan implications for Iran, the focus of this video. So I'm not going to go over the events of Operation Absolute Resolve because I think we've all largely seen them in the mainstream media. But what I do want to talk about specifically is that this wasn't about regime change. It was a leadership change because the US left much of Maduro's government in place. And as I record this, Trump has already made threats against the acting president that she could face a fate worse than Maduro. Now, of course, there are also internal factions within Maduro's own government. And then we have to consider the external opposition from Maria Machado and how this all complicates what could happen next in Venezuela. But running alongside all these developments are the statements directed towards the Islamic Republic of Iran. And of course, the Trump meeting with Benjamin Netanyahu. These are different theatres. They are different legal justifications for engagement, but there is a single coherent message here. And before going into that, I want to understand why Venezuela matters for Iran and why it's watching these events so closely. It's worth setting the context of these two countries' relationship. Now, when you look at a map, you may well think that the relationship between Venezuela and Iran is completely random, almost impossible. And while they're physically distant, ideologically, they haven't been for a while. You see, in the early 2000s, when Hugo Chavez took over Venezuela, this built a much closer shared ideology, anti-US positioning, and mutual isolation. What began as political symbolism quickly evolved into practical cooperation. Firstly, in energy. Iran supplied refined fuel, spare parts, technical expertise to keep Venezuela's oil sector running under sanctions. Sanctions evasion. Caracas provided Iran with financial channels, shipping routes, and front companies in the Western Hemisphere. Then, of course, security operation. The relationship expanded over time into military and dual-use cooperation, a strategic partnership signed a few years ago, including drone technology and training. And fourthly, investment and debt. Billions of dollars in Iranian investments, many linked to security state entities, were tied up in long-term deferred arrangements rather than, say, liquid returns. In short, Venezuela was not a marginal partner for Iran. It was arguably, in the eyes of some, Tehran's most strategic foothold outside of the Middle East. And we saw this also with Hezbollah present on the ground in Venezuela in the aftermath of the 2018 election. So it doesn't come as a surprise then why Venezuela's events matter beyond Latin America. It's not just another unstable state on its periphery. It is an energy superpower on paper, holding the world's largest proven oil reserves. It's a political symbol, a regime that defined itself through opposition to the United States and embedded itself with this broader anti-Western, anti-US axis. Over the past decade, Caracas has become particularly a geopolitical hub for American rivals. It's offered China energy security beyond US-controlled supply chains. It provided Iran with this sanctions evasion platform in the Western Hemisphere, and it has allowed, of course, Russia to project influence uncomfortably close to US shores. So in that sense, Venezuela functioned as an insurance policy, proof that US dominance in its own hemisphere can be contested. So Trump's move does not merely remove Maduro, it dismantles, in my mind, increasingly the entire anti-Western strategic ecosystem in stroke by stroke. Firstly, Venezuela, possibly Cuba, and then Iran. Where else does it go? Just as importantly, it sends a signal to governments across Latin America, from Colombia to Mexico, mind you, that long-held assumptions about non-intervention and regional autonomy may no longer apply in the same way they once did. Indeed, whilst I don't exactly expect military action against, say, Mexico, Cuba very much is on that list, and as I say, do subscribe and ring the bell to know when I produce the subsequent videos in this series, because each requires its own focus in turn. There's just too many factors here, and I think it would be a disservice to try to squeeze it all into one simple video. Trump has been explicit about the economic dimension of this intervention. He's not shying away pretending that this is about human rights or democratic restoration. It is openly about America's interests in the energy sector and prepared to invest heavily in Venezuela's oil sector, and that Washington intends to play a central role in managing the country's recovery, i.e. just administering it. Marco Rubio is effectively the state administrator for Venezuela. Now, in some ways, it could be a strategic and economic win, but the reality is much more constrained. Venezuela today produces under 1 million barrels a day, a fraction of its historical output. Years of sanctions, mismanagement, corruption, and underinvestment have also hollowed out its energy infrastructure. And even with large-scale American investment, restoring its oil industry is going to take a long time, and possibly decades in some people's eyes. So the immediate production gains are limited. As it stands, Chevron is the main company likely to be able to manage any shift here. 3,000 potential workers and existing contracts. But other investors and potential companies with the ability to do so are hesitant because of the internal stability and unpredictability of Trump's own actions over the country. For example, by late 2025, Venezuela was exporting more than 600 barrels a day to China, accounting for roughly 4% of Beijing's total oil imports. These flows were structured through what's known as oil for loan deals, designed explicitly to reduce China's vulnerability to US pressure. But after Maduro's arrest, Beijing was, in. So you could argue with this development here, is America trying to pressure China? Is it trying to control more of the oil output as a way to undermine China's own strategic autonomy, its own economic prowess? Now, the US has been quick to reassure China that that's not the case, but the US has placed itself astride a key supply line for China, which will alienate parts of Beijing, especially as they have their own interests over Taiwan. Now, to bring this all to Iran, with Maduro's removal, the future of this relationship, but specifically in the investments, is completely up in the air. The worst possible moment for Tehran, as it's facing its own economic crisis, the growing discontent and pushback resistance by more and more parts of the country. Losing a strategic partner abroad is the worst possible thing you can imagine. Iran doesn't exactly have many countries it can turn to. Russia is completely caught up in Ukraine, and North Korea or China, well, they each have their respective relations, but neither is going to come to the aid of Iran internally. So just as important as this is psychologically for emboldening the resistance movements across Iran, it's completely the worst for the economic standing, whether or not the regime can resist any intervention by, say, the United States or Israel. For Iran's leadership, it's a precedent that matters even more than those of us who worry about Trump's actions for our personal interests. Inside Iran, these protests have entered a much more volatile phase. Demonstrations have been triggered by not a single policy decision or sudden shock, but an accumulation of the economic conditions, but also a growing discontent with the Islamic Republic's oppressive regime. Falling purchasing power, rising inequality, and the widespread perception of entrenched corruption and elite hypocrisy. What has changed, as I say, is the broader strategic context of allies abroad is coinciding with this unrest. And that simultaneously is impossible for Iran's leadership to manage all at once. After last summer's 12-day war with Israel, which exposed what many described as serious vulnerabilities in Iran's security posture, elite anxiety has never been as high as it is. Rumours, speculation about leadership vulnerability have only intensified, and Khamenei, the supreme leader, well, he is 85. You have to consider time in all of this. He's made a sharp distinction between protesters and agitators, warning that the state will not retreat in the face of what it describes as an attempts to subvert the system. Now, the timing of that message, delivered simultaneously as Maduro's fall, has been widely interpreted as significant, trying to draw distinctions, a much more conciliatory tone than what we've seen previously. Now, when it comes to Iran's broader regional dynamics, Venezuela, but also Syria, shared an uncomfortable parallel. Both were backed and politically supported by Moscow, and in both cases that backing proved limited when it mattered most. Despite declarations of strategic partnerships and shared interests, Russia has offered Iran little more than diplomatic support in the past week, and there was no visible military deterrence, no meaningful escalation on Tehran's behalf. It reinforces the simple but hard lesson that many in Iran already understand. Russia's alliances, as much in international relations, are transactional. They're not protective. But it is critical to be clear about what this does not mean. Also, are not likely to see some form of a Operation Absolute Resolve carried out in Iran. The circumstances are completely different. Iran's topography alone represents a radically more complex military environment to operate. Mountainous terrains, diverse population centres, hardened facilities, and depth that Venezuela simply does not have. Any large-scale form of direct intervention would involve vastly higher costs, risks, and escalation pathways, which the US, and certainly Israel, would be more wary of. Logistically, Iran is not isolated as well. It sits at the centre of this multiple areas of theatre, with far greater potential for spillover, retaliation, and regional escalation, although we can argue in what capacity if they're unable to even quell their own uprisings. Iran is under huge pressure, and it seems highly likely that this may be something that both Washington and Israel seek to exploit, but largely through indirect or limited means, i.e. supporting the resistances as they are ongoing, or perhaps through things like airstrikes. In the most basic sense, the US does not need to do a Venezuela in Iran. Iranians are doing that themselves. That does not make the situation safer. It makes it more precarious because it means Washington can afford to wait, signal, and to let internal dynamics erode the regime's position without triggering the risk of any form of direct intervention. Tehran unwisely continues to hope Moscow may do something, but ultimately it won't, and neither will China, because China never gets involved in these matters. It simply sees them as internal issues. And, well, doesn't, as I said in another video, really care who manages the country as long as it gets what it needs. The situation in Venezuela and America's operations there will be far more on the list of priorities, and how China seeks to respond, or at least mitigate the implications. Operation Absolute Resolve is norm-shattering. Much like the Iraq War reshaped global assumptions about intervention, sovereignty, and the legalities of war, Trump's actions in Venezuela risk accelerating a world in which power increasingly outweighs precedent and legal restraint. Russia will interpret this as a validation of its own conduct. China will be drawing conclusions around Taiwan, and any smaller states that conclude that international law, the rule of law and democracy are going to be a lot more concerned, especially in Europe, of which I will come to in a future video. Tehran, the lesson is stark. Allies can fall by the wayside, guarantees are fragile, and internal weaknesses invite external pressure. There are no values, simply interests, and Iran now faces a combination of external pressure, internal erosion, and strategic isolation, whilst seeing what's happened in Venezuela adding to that. This is not a crisis created out of overnight, but years of growing discontent. And the fall of Maduro does not mean Tehran is necessarily directly next, but it does mean the margin for error, the options that the Islamic Republic have, are near zilch. And in this new utter international disorder, survival may depend less on ideology and purely on adaptability, legitimacy, economic resilience, but as we're seeing with the growing pressure and emboldenedness from Iranians, capitulation. But let me know in the comments, guys, what you think about this. I hope you enjoyed the video. Do subscribe, do give me a comment, and you can find links in the description to join me on Substack or support me with a coffee or anything else. But we'll see you all tomorrow for another update of these unprecedented, insane developments. So, see you soon.